morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Welcome to the first CERBA national event with Chris Weafer on effects of COVID-19 on the economies of Eurasian countries. My name is Vera Didula. I'm an acting regional director at CERBA Toronto chapter, and I will guide you through some technical moments and rules of today's event. First of all, please note that all your videos will be switched off and audio muted. So if you'd like to ask Mr. Weafer a question, please, you can do so. We would highly appreciate you can write down your name and your company name and then submit your question to the Q&A box. We will address all the questions during the Q&A session afterwards. If you have any direct question to Mr. Weafer, or you'd like to continue the discussion further with macro advisory, please reach out directly to Mr. JP Natkin, the Managing Director of Macro Advisory. All the contacts would be available at the end of the webinar, as well as on the CERBA website. If you experience any problems finding that contacts, please reach out to myself or Alex Patient, the CERBA Moscow chapter regional director, who will help you out. I would also like to note that today's webinar will be recorded and the video available on the CERBA YouTube channel, as well as all the presentation would be also posted for your review at CERBA website. If there are any other questions or any help you require, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to assist you on. And so far, this is all I have from my end. Thank you very much for your attention. And this is my great pleasure to pass the word to Mr. Gilles Béton, CERBA National Chairman, and today's event moderator. Gilles, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good.
Well, good morning, good afternoon to all. Gilles Breton here, the Chairman of the National Board of CERBA. Delighted to have you all online today. Well, thank you very much to Mr. Weafer for agreeing to give us a business briefing today. I'd like at first, you will not see, this was on the previous slide that you're not seeing right now, but just a few words about Micro Advisory, an independent Eurasia-based consultancy that provides multinational companies and investors with strategic advisory services, in the region that we're interested in. So, this is a very, we will provide you more information about the Macro Advisory in the course of this event. Macro Advisory carries out market and sectoral analysis, risk assessments, and deep due diligence work across all the key industry sectors in the region. Mr. Weafer, who has worked for many years now in the CIS region, more than 20 years, one of the, I would say, in my own experience, one of the foremost experts in the economy of the region, and one of the best people to provide us what we used to call in foreign ministries economic intelligence. So we're delighted to have him here today with us and to share his 40 years experience in emerging markets. Now, another reminder is that we're working under Chatham House rules, that is no attribution rule, so that, we can have a free discussion. And now I'm sort of going to pass the word over to Mr. Weafer.
Okay, thank you very much, Gilles, and thank you very much to Nathan and Vera for organizing this and for inviting me to speak to you. I'm going to use some slides. They are summary slides. This is not the presentation that will be made available to you later. That presentation is more comprehensive and has more text, etc., and is more standalone. So I will attempt to use some summary slides to illustrate the point. Or the points I'm making. So today we want to talk about the Eurasia region and what's happening in the Eurasia region. That's all of the countries between Ukraine and Mongolia and through Central Asia and the Caucasus. So we're going to run through some of the common themes and touch on one or two of the countries as well. And then I should say, if anybody's got anything more specific about any country, we can deal with it in Q&A, but if you need to follow up, either contact us directly or via CERBA. So the first point is just to look at the instance of the virus in the region. And so just to put it up, and the first point to make, of course, Russia stands out clearly, with most of the cases. These are a couple of days old, so it's even higher. The European kind of facing Eurasia states have more instance. So you can see Belarus with over 6,000, Ukraine with 5,000. The Central Asian states have so far reported relatively few cases. Of course, you can see Tajikistan and Turkmenistan are both claiming to be virus-free. Now, the anecdotal evidence, of course, says that is not the case. There is plenty of anecdotal evidence to confirm that both countries are dealing with the virus in their countries, but officially they're not declaring any numbers, and otherwise Mongolia is relatively small and has got no deaths. But it's fair to say that the virus is now spreading in the region. Nobody is escaping this virus. So if we go to what we have done in the last couple of days is that we have we've looked at the effect on the economies and have kind of recalculated our forecasts across the region. So you can see obviously the actual in 2009, and some of these numbers are very big because they're a low base, they're very small economies, they're fast developing. So these numbers are not that unusual for this region, for these economies. But you can see that we're pretty much come rattling down fairly heavily across the board in all countries, and only a couple of countries are expected to have positive growth this year. There's always question marks over the Turkmenistan numbers, but we'll assume that they will report positive numbers this year. And Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, benefiting, I suppose, from the fact that they're gold producers and they are relatively insulated. The combination of factors that's hitting the region, of course, it's partly the slowdown of COVID, and we can see that most countries have initiated some sort of lockdown. Their economies have slowed down, so it's quite clear. We're very familiar with that from all countries in the world. But in addition, of course, we have the hydrocarbon effect. Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan are hydrocarbon economies, so they've all been badly affected in one way or another. Exports, current accounts, budget receipts have all been hit badly because of the low oil price, as well as, of course, the low gas price and lower demand, so volumes as well as price in many cases. The second factor is remittances. As we know, Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan in particular are heavily dependent. The first two more, the Uzbekistan's economy is now broadening out, but Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, very heavily dependent on remittances. Uzbekistan, it is still an important factor, as it is in Armenia and to some extent Ukraine as well. So those remittances have all come down because migrant workers, of course, are losing their jobs or are having to go home. A lot of it from Russia. And we saw that in 2014 and 15 as well. It was the migrant workers that really took the brunt of the unemployment in the Russian economy, and therefore they transferred that problem back to Central Asia. And the other factors that are hitting economies, for example, Armenia and Georgia, are both being hit hard because of this kind of hard stop on tourism. Both those economies have benefited and have grown the last couple of years, and we're planning to grow. And Uzbekistan as well, we're planning to grow with higher rising levels of tourism coming into the country. And of course, that is also now stopped. If we look at currencies, the other factor I wanted to mention, because it's really coming from Moscow and the ruble. The oil price has come down. The ruble is free floating against the oil price. Again, just a couple of days ago, we can see the ruble was down 18.5% since the beginning of the year. That has a contagion effect on, say, the Kazakh tenge, which is down 11%, the Belarus ruble down 14%. you know, and we can see Ukraine, Uzbekistan currencies as well. So all countries in the region have had to devalue their currencies in order to stay competitive against their neighbors. So Kazakhstan and the other countries in the Eurasian Economic Union, of course, have an open border, free movement of trade, goods, capital, services across the border. And therefore, they have to pay attention to what's happening to the Russian ruble, and they have to stay competitive relative to it. Otherwise, as we saw in 2014, the Kazakhs in particular were badly impacted by people simply crossing the border, buying cars and buying durable goods and bringing them back as they could. So they had to devalue the tenge in order to stay competitive. And you're getting a ripple effect then across the region as one country has to look to its neighbors. Uzbekistan was the most recent to devalue. Up to a few weeks ago, the Uzbeki som was actually flat on the year. They were, if you like, being able to ignore the devaluation effect across the region. But last week, they devalued the som again, and it's for competitive reasons. As also the other reason, apart from competitive reasons, economic competitive reasons, the other reason, of course, is that most of these countries, they rely on kind of FX remittances in one form or another, whether it's from exporting metals and minerals or oil and gas, or from tourism, or from worker remittances. Foreign currency is important to almost all these countries. And therefore, you know, it's a big impact on the budgets, and therefore devaluing the currency means, of course, that you have got a better, in terms of local currencies, you're able to withstand that to a greater extent. The other factor that's coming across the region, of course, is the revised budgets. And again, we're all familiar with this across the board. You know, income has gone down, either it's because of hydrocarbons or metals and mineral trade, trade with China, etc. It's all gone down. So the revenue side has collapsed. Income tax and sales taxes all collapsed at a time when almost all countries are spending more money. Initially, to help people through this crisis, also some key industries and some vital parts of the economy, keeping the lights on to some extent. So, you know, that's inevitably therefore led to kind of a budget deficit. So you can see every single country now in the region is going to report a budget deficit this year. This is a first stab. I'm not sure what the technical economic term for it is, but basically what it's called is the best guess we can come up with at this stage, because we're dealing at the early stages, of course, with the COVID crisis. We simply don't know how long it's going to last, what will be the shape of the recovery, how quickly recovery will come, and we don't know how much extra money governments will have to put in to their economies in order to keep the economy viable. So this is a very much first estimate of the effect on the budgets, and I've no doubt that we will be revising these numbers again in the summer, and probably again in the autumn. What, of course, the rising budget deficit has done is, of course, also leading to a higher level of debt. And we can see some countries are in a better or worse situation than others. So countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, all have reserves. They've all built up reserves in the last couple of years into sovereign wealth funds of one sort or another, and are able to draw on that, at least for the moment. Again, it depends on how long this will last, how bad it'll be, but at least they're able to draw on that, and therefore are not facing any major financial pressures. But then there are others. So Belarus is now talking both to the EBRD and to the IMF. They did at one point suggest that they might have to renegotiate external debt, and it was even suggested that they might default, but they very quickly pulled back from that suggestion. But they are negotiating with the IMF, the EBRD, and with basically anybody else that they can get money from. Georgia is also looking to raise money externally. Uzbekistan is also negotiating to raise additional debt, basically across the board. Mongolia in the same situation, as is the Kyrgyz Republic. So pretty much everybody, with the exception of the kind of three major oil states that have reserves, and Turkmenistan clearly does not, but is not in a position to ask for any external aid from the IFIs in particular. That may or may not change. The pressures are clearly building in that country. My guess is that they will turn first to Moscow for help, but then we'll see how bad it gets and how long it lasts. So that's kind of a sweep through the region, and you know, what is the first run look, as it were, on the effect on kind of national balance sheets, growth, etc. It's all bad, and it's only a question at this stage of how long this lasts. And if we look at the next slide, what's next and what we're looking at? Well, I'm kind of looking at this in terms of 5 phases, and it's a bit, you know, like dealing with any problem in phases. I suppose I could have put panic in there first, although we haven't seen a whole lot of that, thankfully, this time around. But phase 1, we're kind of still in, as it were, which is dealing with the crisis. It's unfolding. It's putting in place emergency measures. We can hear various governments now extending the lockdowns that they've put in place, extending, you know, travel restrictions, social restrictions of all sorts. So these are ongoing, and as they're dealing with the numbers and waiting for this, you know, hope for, you know, peak in infections to arrive, etc. So we're in that first phase, and it means that governments therefore are having to each week announce new measures and new financial aid. So it's building up. The hope is that we might get through that, or at least some settlements, some plateauing perhaps, by the end of this month, and then we can move to phase 2. And phase 2 is where you get kind of time to look at the damage, as it were, the situation you're in, and then start to make some changes. And in this case, I would expect to see governments making budget changes. We've already had it from Ukraine, but that was pretty much a knee-jerk reaction, and bearing in mind that they're trying to apply maximum pressure on the IMF to give them money, it's no surprise that they will have come with a fairly aggressive budget revision showing a very big deficit this year, and somebody has to pay for it. But everybody else is taking their time, and I would expect probably late May, maybe coming into June, we'll start getting the kind of first adjustments, changes to the budget based on what can be seen at that point in time. And then thereafter, perhaps through the summer months, and again, this is kind of like the nice scenario, as it were, or maybe the practical scenario, we get a period where governments simply, you know, they've made the adjustments to the budget, they're dealing with the problem, and then it's, okay, now what do we do? You know, what should be our priorities? What can we do? You know, what can we do, if, like, to try and attract investments, to improve the situation, to grow the economy? And we'll get that reassessment. So there'll be a great deal of, I think, of this type of policy kind of debates and strategizing, as it were, in the summer with governments as well as for companies. And then phase 4, I would expect in the fall or the autumn, which is maybe a more comprehensive review of all government situations and more comprehensive changes to budgets. And that might mean then increased taxation, certainly looking to shift priorities that were in place before, maybe spending priorities, etc. But it's likely September, October is when we get the more extensive, comprehensive changes, and that then kind of will allow us as investors, as companies, to start looking at what does this mean for your operation in those countries, and just have a better idea of what 2021 is likely to look at. So it's an evolving situation, and anybody who thinks they've got a good idea of what 2021 is going to look like in any country in this region is either, well, no, they're lying, the technical term for it. So phase 5, I just mentioned, that's where you basically get the major changes coming into 2021, and we start to see what is the legacy from this in terms of priorities. And this is where we will start to see, I believe, more kind of more of a discussion on perhaps on localization. On hopefully it will mean that governments will start to become more serious about improving the investment climate, the business climate, And we're hearing this a lot in Russia. We're hearing it maybe less so in other countries in the region, but it's something I would expect is that not, I would not expect some sort of an isolationist type approach or some sort of an insular approach. I would actually expect much more about what are we going to do to make ourselves more attractive, to bring more investment in, because really it's the only way out of this. There's not going to be any free money for anybody, as it were, and that will provide therefore opportunities for foreign companies, and I would expect that in terms of carrot and stick, the carrot will be more attractive later this year and coming into next year, and then perhaps we'll see a more aggressive stick. But the one kind of red flag, as it were, is very likely we will see tax changes. Governments everywhere will need to look to raise extra money. Now, they're not going to be able to do it by hitting corporation tax, certainly amongst SMEs. They're not going to be able to do it by hitting income tax, particularly up in middle class, and probably not sales tax or VAT. But they'll be looking at extractive industries. I'll mention it when I come to one or two countries, but resource nationalism is already kind of rearing its head again. Extra taxation and extractive industries is something companies will have to deal with. And also maybe wealth taxes of various sorts. So what the critical factors that we'll be looking at, you don't need to dwell a great deal on this. COVID-19, clearly how it works, the global impacts, who'll be buying your products, so the resumption of global trade, the oil price, again, goes without saying. We could spend all day talking about the oil price and still be wrong. What we can say is that, and I really am convinced that what we've seen recently do represent the lows, because what I do expect to see in the next couple of weeks is a much bigger shakeout of the higher cost producers in the US. In other words, US shale volumes are absolutely going to have to go down, because when you look at the kind of costs spread over the last 5 or 6 years, the way that US shale volumes have grown, and you think that now anywhere below $35, then a big chunk of what that added volume over the last 4 or 5 years is not sustainable. And I think that really is the OPEC plus strategy, is to wait that out. So we're not looking at a rapid recovery in the oil price under any circumstance, but what we can talk about is the oil price getting to a higher level and then plateauing off. And at least it eases the pain for the producers. But then clearly, in addition to that, each country will have to look at their budgets, what they have to play with, confidence factor, that'll be shot the heck. You've seen, remember today, the PMI numbers across Europe well down. Again, this is an indication of companies, what their expectations is, what they're planning. And I would expect that in every country, and also investment priorities, what will remain. So if we'll start to move away from just the general picture in the whole region, so we can deal with questions later. But if we look at some of the major countries, and the first one, Russia, and I'll run through these slides fairly quickly and just going to get the good news out of the way first. And this is a nice, pretty picture that we could frame, because we're not going to see it for a while. This is the leading indicator for the economy. It brings it up to February, and essentially at the end of February, there was a lot of confidence that Russia's economy could grow by even up to 3% this year, but certainly well over 2%. And it was being driven by the growth in retail sales, in the recovery in construction sector for the first time in many years, and extra budget spending. But anyway, we don't need to spend too much time on that, because that's already history. And we can see the reasons for that is that the economy is in lockdown, industries are on vacation, essentially, SMEs particularly, so small businesses, retail, cafes, shops, etc. They're all, as we know, all completely shut, and a lot of them will not reopen, of course. Tax revenues are below, and other tax receipts from VAT, from corporation tax, they're all well down. And the government is having to spend a lot more money in support of people and small industries. While it's essentially waiting to see what will be the impact. And national projects, I just highlight this clearly. This is the big spending program. I remind you that at one point this was $400 billion program. At the current exchange rate, it's a $350 billion program. It is going to change. I mean, we will definitely see priorities changing. Some aspects of this program will be delayed for quite some time. I guess the government right now, I assume, is looking at what are the priorities and what should be the priorities. So again, implications for companies who are looking at these projects, we're participating in them, we're planning to participate, there will be changes. So I would expect areas like digitalization, obviously healthcare areas, some infrastructure projects where you can have an impact in the economy, such as port building and road building. Again, I would expect these all to continue. But areas like culture, education, retraining, etc., there's a whole list of projects that can certainly be delayed and are likely to be delayed. The good news about Russia, and to some extent it's Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan as well, is that Russia is in a relatively good position. And this is, this is a big difference. This is my fourth crisis in Russia, 98, 99, 08, 09, 14, 15. This is different in that the government doesn't have to panic. It has resources. It has financial resources, and I'm not going to say that sanctions have been good, but the first round of sanctions certainly forced the government into making changes that have left the country in a better position today. Had we not had those sanctions applied in 2014, then I believe Russia would not be in such a good position today to deal with this crisis. They would not have the low level of debt and the high level of savings of financial resources available to it, had it not been for the changes forced on it by sanctions. We certainly probably would not have a budget that is much less exposed to the oil price. I remind you, in 2013, the budget needed $115 per barrel to balance. Last year, it balanced at around $50. And before this crisis, it was looking like it would balance at 47. Now, clearly, that's all going to change. But we have, at least in Russia, the weak ruble does counterbalance weak oil to some extent. It takes the sting out of it. And it means, therefore, that the budget is not suffering the big hit on lost hydrocarbon receipts that it would have done previously, and certainly it leaves in a much better position than the Saudis, despite all of these kind of headlines about, my costs are lower than yours. That doesn't matter. It's about budgets and funding budgets and keeping social spending up and development spending up, both for President Putin and for Crown Prince Mohammed. And in that sense, Russia is in a better position than it used to be, and than most of the OPEC countries are today. Looking just fairly quickly on the ruble, obviously I mentioned this is one factor that we are looking at. There is no evidence that the central bank has spent any meaningful amount of money trying to defend the ruble. They learned that lesson in 2015 when they were burning through money and risk bankrupting the country. So they stopped it. And they are not looking to defend the ruble, especially when the ruble is being pulled by something outside their control, which is the oil price. So hence we see the ruble moving now in a closer tandem with the oil price than we had seen through last year. The central bank and the government are basically, I won't say they're happy to by no means, but they are letting the ruble find a level based on where oil is, and then they'll deal with it, maybe use soft mechanisms to try and pull it lower. But there is no attempt to bring this back to the 65 level, which is where they would really like it to be over the medium term. They will try to get it back to 65, I think, over the next year or so. But there is certainly no intentions of using resources to pull this down until oil price kind of allows that. So we'll definitely be looking at weaker ruble for this year. We have the central bank policy meeting tomorrow. Governor Nabulina did indicate that she was hoping she would be able to cut the interest rate to support the economy and small businesses at this meeting. Given what's happened this week to the ruble and the oil price, that now seems unlikely. I don't expect him to raise the rate. I suppose that's the good news. But it's very likely we'll have to wait for a rate cut. But then we'll see what they say. I think everything is open. The one thing is inflation is low. And I should point that out, that there have been concerns that this ruble collapse kind of brings up fears of 2015 when, you recall, in the first quarter, inflation spiked to 17%. That's not going to happen this time. Ruble is, the inflation basket is much different. There has been a substantial change in the mix of the inflation basket. So in other words, Russia imports a lot less than it used to. The consumer basket is much more domestically orientated than it used to be. So weak ruble will not have the same inflationary effect as it did several years ago in previous crisis. So we can talk about the inflation going up. Remember, it was 2.5% year on year at the end of March. We can talk about it going up to maybe 6 or 7%. We're not looking at 15 or 16%. So in that sense, the central bank doesn't have to raise the rate to try and keep inflation down. It's a question of when they will have confidence about stability in the financial market, maybe to start lowering their rate. But that seems a little bit early yet. So in terms of what does this mean, we always use scenarios, not just for Russia, but for all countries. So this is our base case. This does look optimistic, and certainly compared to the IMF, who put out a 5% contraction forecast recently. You know, we describe ourselves as being pragmatists. We're not professional optimists. We're not professional pessimists. If my mailbag contains equal numbers of those who complain about my optimism and my pessimism, then I guess I'm okay. We describe ourselves as being practical. We look at what's happening, take an assessment based on the facts. So we try to avoid the emotional side of it, which, of course, when it comes to our part of the world, is far too emotion when there shouldn't be. And one should look at facts and trends in the facts. And I have to say, a little bit of advertisement, the last few years, our numbers have generally been more right than wrong for that. And we've had to change them much less often than others. Anyway, so much for that. This is our base case forecast, and say that's average oil price of 36. Therefore, it's assuming oil price recovery in the second half of the year, which keeps the ruble in the 70s, the deficit relatively small, and GDP recovering next year. That's the base case at this point. But as I strongly point out, this is our first run at this, and we will almost certainly be changing this in the summer when the facts start to change and when the facts become available, and we have a better idea of what's happening in the second half of the year coming into next year. This is our pessimistic scenario, which again looks more like the IMF. This is kind of, again, assuming the oil price stays lower for longer. It therefore has a bigger hit on the ruble-dollar exchange rate. The budget surplus is higher, and it certainly could be higher than this. You can see the retail consumer sector is taking the biggest hit, but even here, inflation is not that bad. But you are looking in the pessimistic case of a contraction in the first half of next year as well. So kind of this period lasting for longer, being more damaging. So again, I can come back on Russia. There is a lot more detail on the Russia. There's a lot more detail on the Russia story in the presentation, which CERBA will distribute later. We go into a lot more of the details and the explanation from that. But I say, happy to take Q&A on any aspect of Russia later. So if we look now, move into the other Eurasia states. So looking first at Kazakhstan. In terms of COVID, we'll open up the graph just to see. Again, this is all picking up from middle of March. The country is in lockdown. The government is putting in place the measures, support measures, financial measures. It is drawing on the sovereign wealth fund, and right now its priority is simply social supports. It has locked down tightly both the cities of Almaty and Nur-Sultan, which has certainly led to speculation that they're also worried about a surge in protests and political opposition, which was already a problem they were dealing with before this crisis hit. And I guess there is therefore a real concern that as we move forward in this crisis, criticism of government action might lead to kind of a resurgence of the political criticism. And there's also, of course, a lot of speculation about former President Nazarbayev. Where is he? He hasn't been visible. What does it mean? So there's a lot of uncertainty in Kazakhstan. And I said the government priority right now is very much about containment. We are not yet seeing anything coming out of Kazakhstan in terms of what might be the priorities for dealing or for recovering the economy later. Here we have the again on our looking at the more detail of the macro changes. To say we were previously looking at a 2% growth, 4% growth this year based on oil recovery. As you know, there's been big investment programs in the Kyrgyz field, in the Kashagan field, and also Kashagan oil production was rising. So we were looking for about a 4% growth this year, again, be propelled by hydrocarbons. Clearly, that's now off the table. So a 2% contraction seems reasonable. Again, you're not looking at inflationary pressures. The budget deficit certainly rising. The government does have to spend a lot more money on social supports and keeping the situations stable. And as I mentioned with regard to the tenge, they are very much the National Bank's policy, despite what they say. Their policy is essentially to look at where the Russian ruble is trading and then to keep it in that 5.5% to 6% range for competitive reasons. And we've seen that. So it might be a little bit cynical, but in practical terms, that's a good way to look at it. They do seem to want to keep the tenge in that 5.5% to 6% relative to the Russian ruble. The big issue in Kazakhstan, and one we're following closely, is regard to the banks. And dollarization is a huge problem still in Kazakhstan. They never managed to sort this out. It basically means there is a very high percentage of loans in the banking system that are foreign exchange denominated, whether it's dollars or euros, cheap interest rate loans, which have now, of course, in tenge terms, have become so much more bigger and therefore more expensive for borrowers, and they really can't afford to pay them back, or not as easily as they might have done. So there's a real question mark over exactly what is the state of non-performing loans, the quality of assets in the banks. Not so much the big bank, Halyk Bank, because of course Halyk did benefit from the bank restructuring several years ago, where Kazakhstan created a so-called bad bank with $7.5 billion worth of assets taken into that, and then the remaining good parts of the BTA and the other banks being put into Halyk. So Halyk is okay, but there is question marks over the other banks. Sorry, see an error, a spelling check error there. But so we're watching that. But while they're dealing with that, again, don't expect much in terms of policy changes or for the government to start talking about what it might do in terms of attracting investment and which parts of the Nurli's oil program will be prioritized and which will be delayed. So again, we'll start to see that, I think, in the summer. Uzbekistan, again, dealing with the problem, not so much in terms of cases or deaths. Again, we see that across Central Asia. It's been relatively well contained. The government, of course, has reacted very quickly to the issue as they could see what was happening in Europe and elsewhere. They locked down Tashkent and other cities very quickly and very tightly, and it is very tightly locked down with the view to containing the spread. And so far, that appears to be working quite well. There is certainly an issue with the economy. Remember, Uzbekistan was in any case drawing in a lot of foreign aid and foreign loans as it was modernizing the power sector, irrigation, it was looking to build up the tourism sector, agriculture sector. And so this is obviously, I want to say it's coming at bad times because there's no such thing as a good time for a crisis like this, but it does mean that Uzbekistan, in order to keep the momentum, is now looking to raise more debt and to attract more aid from the IFIs to sustain these programs, and that looks likely it'll happen. There's no reason why it should not be the case. In terms of the economic impact, again, just we can still see positive growth in Uzbekistan this year. It's not the 5.5% we were looking at previously. There is a big hit to some of the areas that we were expecting to grow. Tourism was definitely expected to be a big contributor to growth this year, and that's now come to a hard stop. The horticultural sector was the one area of agriculture that was growing very fast and contributing very strongly, and was expected to be a big contributor this year, along with fruit and vegetables. And again, these areas have slowed right down. The big issue for Uzbekistan is, you see here, inflation in any case was already double digit. This is the legacy of having had to devalue the currency and to, of course, eliminate the dual currency system of several years ago, which you can see was done in 2017. And there's still an inflationary impact of that, as well as, of course, government spending on programs and raising salaries and trying to bring the country up to a kind of a more sustainable kind of economic level, all of which are very positive and are exactly what needs to happen. But you do have a legacy of high inflation, and therefore you've got a legacy of high interest rates, although the central bank did cut the rate recently from 16 to 15%, which is, I guess, an indication of faith that they're hoping inflation will start to come down, and to ease pressure, of course, on small businesses and on households. But still, this is certainly is an issue. The budget deficit going up, the current account, of course, taking a big hit as exports go down. But foreign debt is still not an issue. It's still less than 30%. And, you know, because it was a very low base only a few years ago, the legacy of having been closed for 25 years, even though the country is adding debt, it's not such a big issue. There's still a very comfortable zone comfortable financial position, as it were. So it's very much a case of just battening down the hatches, riding through this, and then being in the best position possible to resume the programs that the government had focused on. So there are some, of course, big delays. The privatization program, which was a big objective this year, to privatize a lot of the banks, chemical companies and other state companies. The president, remember, signed a decree in that area this year. And that's, of course, now all been delayed, as, of course, was the first international investment forum, which was planned for Tashkent, I think March was it, and now that's also been delayed. So it's very much a delay. In the case of Uzbekistan, this is not a derailment. This is a delay. Other countries are facing more of a derailment, but in Uzbekistan's case, there's no reason to assume that they kind of won't resume where they left off once they come out the other end or in a better position to do so. They still, of course, have big issues to deal with, which were very evident before this, which is the fact that, you know, bureaucracy and regulations and the difficulty for foreign companies to actually get things done and to make progress and to get you know, to get permissions to do things in the country, that was already becoming an irritant and slowing down investment in the country before this. So our discussions with people in Tashkent and government people in Tashkent recently suggest that they are aware of that, and they know they have to kind of deal with this much faster in order to try and catch up. So again, we might see this as part of the silver lining, as it were, from this particular crisis. And Belarus, well, as we all know, Belarus is dealing with this problem differently. They have, of course, a rising number of cases. President Lukashenko, though, is refusing to impose any domestic restrictions. He has closed the border and therefore restricted kind of external movement. But internally, they are not putting any restrictions, so they stand out as you know, as a country with obvious COVID infections and rising deaths, but not yet willing to impose restrictions. So the Football League, for example, is now famous around the world because it's one of the few football leagues that bookies and others can look at and take bets on. The other one just recently being the reopening of the Turkmenistan Football League, the Tajik Basketball League. I think that's pretty much it in terms of leagues around the world. So Belarus League is now famous, but of course it means that, you know, no restrictions. But the evidence is that people, at least, are not behaving this way. That they're, even though schools are open, the attendance levels are minimal, and people are at least not going out. They're paying attention to what's happening in the rest of the world, and are, you know, voluntarily self-isolating and adopting these stringent controls. And therefore it means that even though the government is saying there's no restrictions and the economy is operating, it is actually massively slowed down because people have a different attitude to the government. So we will definitely see a big impact on the economy in Belarus, and and a hard hit. So we've gone for a 5% decline from, we were previously looking at 1.5% growth, a big reversal. Remember, Belarus really had lived far too long on subsidies from Russia, the cheap fuel, which in any case was disrupted because Russia was changing that system. And now, of course, the price of fuel, the demand for fuel and refined product in Europe has collapsed. So nobody wants to buy it. So the subsidy doesn't even matter. There's just no kind of end buyers for the product, and that's really hit them very, very hard. Secondly, the transshipment. Belarus was doing very well, as we know, as a transit country for goods coming into Europe, from Europe into Russia, and vice versa. Sanctions busting, I suppose, is another way to describe it. But they were doing very well on the transport side, and also the trains from China, the BRI trains coming into the Great Stone Park, and a lot of companies, had set up facilities in the Great Stone Park to benefit from that kind of BRI system, and all of that has substantially gone down, as well as demand for minerals and potash from China. So Belarus really has been hit very hard, and they are now talking to the EBRD, the IMF, as well as to Moscow, looking to raise debt to cover the deficit. But again, I say they're in a rock and a hard place here because Belarus is not a priority country for Europe. There is a very cool political relationship with Moscow. Very likely, President Lukashenko will have to make concessions, I think, to Moscow to get aid. We'll see how that plays out over the next couple of months. But of all the countries in the region, Belarus is in one of the most difficult situations in terms of its economy and financing and its ability to service its debt and to roll over debt repayments, which are due later this year and coming into next year. It will need to borrow a lot more money. And that also suggests, therefore, either it's going to become super friendly and open to foreign investors to attract them in, or it is going to be dealing with a very difficult position for a very long time. So it's very much kind of now on the table for President Lukashenko and his government to decide which way they're going to go. Right now, they're just managing the crisis day to day. So in Ukraine, again, as I mentioned, apart from Russia, we saw the first slide, apart from Russia, Ukraine very much open to, of course, to Europe. It's got a very high rate of viruses and deaths and rising. And again, that's led to the government having to had to shut the country down, lock down the economy, and therefore is suffering the impact of that in terms of economic performance. They were the first to adjust their budget and their economic expectations. And I say part of this is because they're dealing with the IMF, and it suits to have kind of the most negative position possible when you're asking for $5 to $8 billion of additional aid. So this is, they've gone for a bad case scenario. I'm reluctant to use the worst case because who knows, but they've gone for a bad case scenario early on for this to try and manage expectations. Right now, as you know, the key issue for Ukraine is dealing with the IMF, is trying to get that $5 to $8 billion of additional aid unlocked for this year. We do believe that there is very strong political will in Washington to make sure that happens. So really, Kyiv should be able to get it. There were two key conditions that were imposed on Kyiv to get it, the money. One is the land reform bill, the other is the bank reform bill. Now, the land reform bill was diluted from the original proposal, but it has been approved and the IMF have said it's acceptable. So it's at least it moves that forward. It means that it should be easier for foreign investors to invest in Ukraine agriculture and for companies to expand in agriculture. It's not quite as clear and as clean as was hoped, but it's certainly substantially better than it was. So it should help that sector move forward when we get clear of this. The second one, the bank reform bill, is more problematic because, of course, there are some very high profile and powerful oligarchs who've got a vested interest in blocking this and have put I think 16,500 amendments to the first draft to try and block this. But the government have countered with a legislation that means they don't have to pay attention to all of these proposed amendments and can fast track this legislation. So it is not yet done. It is moving forward, and it is the critical factor. If this bill gets passed by the Rada and signed into law by President Zelensky, then the IMF will give the $5 to $8 billion this year, and the country will survive the crisis and be in a better position next year. If they do not pass this bill, then the money will not come, and we will be in another serious crisis coming into the autumn. But as I say, I strongly believe it will get done, and it is generally assumed that because there is no choice really, that the government will have to get it done. So it is still an outstanding issue, but it really should get done. Very quickly, I know I'm taking up a lot of time. I just have one slide each of the remaining countries. This is Armenia. So, as I mentioned, in Armenia, we're looking at a big drop in GDP from what we're expecting, but still should be markedly positive this year because the domestic factors will sustain it. No kind of dramatic moves in terms of inflation or policy rates. The budget balance or budget deficit definitely goes up. The current account, of course, gets a bad hit, but it's always been negative anyway. So the big issue for Armenia, of course, is a big drop in demand for copper, which is hitting the current account and trade. Big drop in tourism, which is hitting foreign earnings, and generally tourism and the mining sector together bringing the economy down. The government is being criticized heavily for the way it's dealing with the crisis. There's been allegations that it has been using the lockdown to suppress political opposition and to control media. Again, we're seeing that in other countries as well. It's not something I would be overly concerned about at this stage. They've had to backtrack anyway. But for now, it's there's nothing they can do. It's ride through this and then kind of hope to be able to rebuild the tourism industry and try and attract more investment into the technology sector, which is one of the kind of long-term hopes, and then assume that the mining industry recovers in the back of demand. In Azerbaijan, this is one country that is different in the sense that the currency is effectively pegged to the dollar at 1.7. It's kind of varied at 1.69, 1.705, but it's effectively there. I do believe that they will have to devalue this year on the back of this. Not doing it right now, maybe a 10%, could be higher, but I think we're definitely seeing a devaluation coming in order to kind of better manage the foreign exchange flows into the budget, as well as to maintain competitiveness relative to the neighbors, all of whom are seeing devalued currencies. So that's one thing I do expect, but they've got a dollarization problem in the banking system as well. So they've been very reluctant to let the manat weaken because it could undermine the banking system, but I think they'll have no choice. But otherwise, it's a case of, they've got the money in the Sovereign Wealth Fund. They should be able to ride it through. It really does depend on what happens to the oil price. The projects that they have in the Caspian. And one thing, of course, Azerbaijan does have in its favor is that it has been investing a lot into gas production in the Caspian, and the Southern Gas Corridor, which is this pipeline from Azerbaijan across Turkey into Greece and into Europe. And again, that will open up a new export route for Azerbaijan gas. So long term, it's still hydrocarbon dependent, and there's not much evidence of diversification away from that. But if you assume that we're going to see some recovery in oil and gas and European activity, then Azerbaijan will survive this without many changes, good or bad. In terms of Georgia, again, struggling. The tourism hit has been bad for Georgia. This is a very big part of its economy. Also exporting Georgian wine and food and other vegetables, etc., all of which have now been badly hit. There's too early to talk about political issues or instability. But the government, of course, has been very kind of scrupulous, or is that the right word? Been dealing with this crisis very tightly. They have locked down to policing in other cities and towns very tightly, very early on to contain the crisis. But they don't have the resources. They're dealing with the political fallout and are likely, therefore, to borrow money and already have a very, triple-digit foreign debt, and that's going to go up this year because they will have to borrow more money to ride through this. They don't have the resources otherwise to deal with it. Next country, the Kyrgyz Republic. Again, the relatively few kind of COVID cases. One thing that has, I suppose, helped the Kyrgyz Republic is that the Kumtor mine, is the big mine, of course, that's majority owned by Centera Gold, a Canadian company, is that whole long-standing dispute with Centera has been resolved. The Kumtor mine is operational. The price of gold is doing well. Demand for gold is also one of the few assets that's up this year. So that's saved the country, as it were. So it's helped them earn foreign currency, exports, trade. Even still, though, elsewhere the economy has collapsed, and tourism, again, another factor. So the current account and trade, even though with gold value going up, everywhere else has gone down. So struggling, need IMF bailout, but at least are in a situation where Kumtor is keeping the lights on, and that, is keeping the country relatively stable. But resource nationalism this is one area in this country and in other countries in that part of Central Asia, resource nationalism and a kind of probably an effort to see can they extract more from these mines for the budget. This is likely to be an issue for Centera and other companies in this situation later this year. The Tajikistan, again, not a whole lot to say. Again, should see some kind of minimal growth this year. Not really a big trading country. As you know, their main focus is on trying to attract investment into the Rogun Dam to become a bigger exporter of power. So these projects are all under development, as it were, ongoing. So relatively isolated, I suppose, is one way to put it. Yes, they're taking a big hit domestically in regional trade, but relatively isolated. And when you look at a map, you can obviously see why that is the case. So no huge issues, a big slowdown, but very much, very focused on trying to keep the Rogun project on track, and therefore needing funding and support for that. Turkmenistan, sorry, I have misspelled Turkmenistan, and I do apologize for that. Turkmenistan, there's not a whole lot to say. They are struggling very badly with foreign exchange and foreign currency. Companies that are working in Turkmenistan are seeing more restrictions on their accessing to foreign exchange. Most recently, the government has now ordered all foreign companies to pay their staff in local manat. And that's a huge problem because the exchange rate of the manat is 3.5. The street rate is over 20. So if you have to pay using the official exchange rate and then you've got to go out and spend on the shops, you can clearly see what the problem is. And same for companies who are to bring investment in and convert it at the official exchange rate and then pay people and pay for services at the exchange rate. So it's effectively killed investment. The country does at least have some, it has potential in the sense that it has shaken itself out of this kind of position it was in. It had become far too dependent, captive with China. China's is the big customer for gas. The majority of gas goes across the Central Asian pipeline into China, and China on several occasions has called them up and changed the terms, and there's nothing you can do about it. So at least Turkmenistan government for the last year and a half has been pushing on trying to develop new export routes for its gas. It now is selling gas again to Russia. It is hoping to build a pipeline across the Caspian so they can plug into this southern gas corridor. And of course, it is very focused on the TAPI pipeline, which is Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, that looks dead in the water, but they are putting a lot of at least political effort into it. So Turkmenistan is in real trouble. They have potential, but only if they change the political policies and if the country opens up and adopts more international standards. Then they have a chance because they've got very good resources and they've got a good location. But with the current regime and the current policies of that regime, they're going to continue struggling, and it will be a difficult place for everybody except for the bravest. Mongolia is the last slide I have to show. Mongolia was hit early on because, of course, over 80% of its exports go to China. A lot of that is coal. They did benefit last year and in 2018 from the UN embargo in North Korea, which meant that China had to switch all the coal imports to Mongolia, so they benefited from that. Of course, they have done a deal with Turquoise or Rio Tinto on the copper mine, but there's already a lot of discussion about, again, extra taxation, the fair share of the spoils, in other words, resource nationalism. But Mongolia is very dependent on China. That has done the damage. They are now looking to raise more international debt to cover this budget deficit this year and likely next year, and essentially hoping that they can. And you can see the level of debt is the huge problem they have, which is why they have to abide by IMF restrictions. So Mongolia has come through the worst probably because China is now beginning to reopen, but again struggling and likely to be dealing with resource nationalism before too long. So that's kind of a very long run through the Eurasia region. I'm going to stop there and pass it back to Vera or Nathan, and happy to answer any questions. And I said, just to remind you, the presentation which CERBA is much more detailed, and they will distribute it later, and hopefully that will answer a lot of your questions anyway. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I have a series of questions which I'm supposed to be putting to you because I'm supposed to be the filter of the questions. My first question that I've received was with respect to the credibility of COVID statistics. You alluded to that in the case of the smaller countries. Of course, there was a lot of media coverage about the poor report, statistical report in Russia at the outset. What is your general take on the value of the COVID statistics in the larger countries?
Sure. Well, I think the same issue applies lots of countries. It's testing. In other words, it's a bit like if you don't ask, you won't find out, as it were. So testing clearly is an issue everywhere, and those countries that have been testing the most seem to have a higher level than those with lower level of testing. And so in the case of Russia, there is no credible evidence to say that Russia is dealing with a huge problem. I mean, the anecdotal evidence is not there of, hospitals being overwhelmed or, the Telegram channels or the social media channels talking about a much bigger level of problem than the government is reporting. And as we know, the Telegram channels and other social media in Russia is very quick to highlight discrepancies with what government is saying. There have certainly been video clips of lots of ambulances coming in and preparations being made, but there's no kind of hard evidence to say that any country is suppressing. Okay, I mentioned Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, they're saying they've got no problem, and clearly they have. But if you look at the bigger countries, you could say that it's probably ballpark. They may all have higher levels of COVID cases because they're not testing enough to find out the true extent. But in terms of dealing, say, with the most acute hospital cases and deaths, it's probably not that far off what's been reported because there's no evidence to suggest otherwise.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is perhaps from yours truly. You mentioned localization, you mentioned, and at CERBA, of course, we like trade diversification. So my question has to do with this combination of trade diversification, localization, and protectionism. In our countries, we can see that there will be a tendency to practice more protectionism, so to speak. And what about those countries in their trade relationship with China, for instance? Would there be a tendency or temptation to shift back to some form of protectionism?
No, I would say the likelihood is we will see a much greater effort at localization. So yeah, localization, therefore, as we know, comes in two parts. It means that countries that can provide products or services will try to develop those domestic sources and may very well make it difficult for those who are importing products or services. So I would expect to see kind of more import barriers going up in practical terms. And of course, you know, we all live in that part of the world where, you know, you don't actually have to put a tariff on something to keep it out. It's often been said that there isn't a bureaucrat worth the description in the Eurasia region who cannot keep the WTO busy at the border for years. So there are plenty of ways to kind of make it difficult to import products or services to compete with the locals without actually having to formally put tariffs on, etc. So I would certainly see it becoming more and more difficult for those who are importing to compete with locals in those areas. But I really would expect, certainly in the case of Russia, maybe Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, more of an effort to attract in investors. You know, we have had this for several years, say, with localization, trying to bring more companies in to make products that can be sold. But I think localization is now likely to broaden out and more companies to come in to set up operations, to use those countries as a kind of as an export or as a manufacturing export base. And that's kind of what I'm hearing. So with regard to China, it's a difficult one because even before this crisis, we were already seeing a big pushback in countries like Kyrgyz and Mongolia, etc., against what they were looking at was too big an influence of China. The high level of debt, for example, that countries are running to fund infrastructure, the BRI system, etc. So that was kind of already happening. And I do think that, and when you look at who's now helping in the region, there's a lot of aid coming from not just the Asian Development Bank, but World Bank, EBRD, the US, Germany, as well as Russia. And I do think that, yeah, one of the legacies of this particular crisis is that countries in the region, I think, are more likely to be looking to diversify not just the economic activity and trade partners, but perhaps political relationships as well. At least that's what I'm hearing in its early days yet. But localization, very much a case of trying to secure domestic activity, but also trying to create jobs and to create more export diversification. So we will wait to see who comes up with what. And I think a lot of countries will be looking at the bigger neighbors to see what they do to replicate it. So Russia, Kazakhstan perhaps might take a lead on this, and then other countries follow based on what they see that's working in those countries. But it's very much on the table to a much greater extent now than it was 6 months ago.
To pick up on localization, one of the questions I have is that then the following corollary would be that some states will make it easier for foreign investors to come to the country, right?
Yes.
Indeed.
At least that's what they're saying.
Oh,
we've got to see. We've got to see what happens. Of course, you look. We know. Let's say, you know, we know Russia has been certainly talking about this for some time. It's dealing with sanctions issues, of course, and therefore and reputational issues. But we know the government has put on the table what they call the regulatory guillotine, which is to reduce some bureaucratic regulations and old, outdated laws to make it easier for foreign companies to operate in Russia. So they're moving along. And when we talked to some people in government last week at different ministries, they were very much emphasizing this program is likely to now accelerate. Kazakhstan have also talked about the need to reduce barriers and to make it more attractive, because the Nurli Zoy program, which is President Nazarbayev's legacy program, as it were, the modernization program, it really has stalled. The emphasis has been much more on the Tengiz field and on Kashagan, on hydrocarbons. So they really want to try and accelerate that. And they've been talking very openly about how to make the country more attractive. And Uzbekistan, of course, has been really the poster child in that part of the world. They have been moving very fast to, you know, make it, of course, the whole visa regime has now completely changed and it's very open and very easy. Also, in terms of moving money in and out of the country. But there's still, criticism is still being levied at Tashkent government over bureaucracy. And to some extent, it's a bit like the donkey and the racehorse scenario. The racehorse can run very fast based on some changes, but eventually it has to stop and wait for the donkey because it's carrying the baggage and the bureaucracy and the supply lines, as it were. And Uzbekistan is kind of in that situation right now. The government has kind of done what it can, but it now really needs to change attitudes and to improve the general bureaucracy. And it's different in other countries. Turkmenistan is extremely difficult to invest in. The Kyrgyz Republic is now better than it was a year ago. And if you look at Ukraine and Belarus, Ukraine certainly needs to move very fast, and it is the government's intention to really remove investment barriers. This is a precondition with the IMF program anyway. They've been dealing with domestic political issues, of course, for a long time, and we now would expect them to move very, very fast in the next couple of years. And Belarus is very much at a crossroads. What they need to do is very obvious. They now just need to do it. And if they don't, then the situation there will deteriorate. So it's very much a mixed bag across the region. And even for some industries, like in Kyrgyz Republic, it's now easier to invest in the mining sector than it is perhaps in the agriculture sector. So it's a mixed bag. And this crisis is going to shake it up. So in 6 months' time or 9 months' time, we'll have a better idea of who has grasped the situation and is using it, and who is basically still stuck in their old ways. But there will be peer pressure. Some countries will get it right, and that'll put pressure on the others. So again, I'm deliberately putting my optimistic cap on right now, thinking that this crisis will shake countries into moving faster on programs that they had already talked about. But the pragmatist in me says, well, I want to wait and see it happen before I'm sure either.
Yes, thank you very much. Talking about shake up and shake out, you mentioned oil prices before. The question I have here is, those things that are likely to happen in the next few weeks in the United States, will they not create a pressure to increase oil prices? So that's asking you to put your crystal ball one more time and say, what about oil prices? The OPEC plus deal and the shakeout in the US oil industry, will they not increase or stabilize oil prices?
Well, there's two aspects to it. One is on the demand side, the other is on supply. So the demand side is clearly extremely important. And as we know, right now, demand for oil has collapsed. And the International Energy Agency are saying they believe that about 30 million barrels, so about 30%, has been lost right now. And we're assuming that this is the deep end of the crisis, the worst of it. And therefore, the assumption is that the decline in demand will start to ease. And that's the basis that we've used in our assumption as well. We see a kind of a 30 million hit this month, perhaps a 20 million hit in Q2, rising to a 10 million hit average in Q3, rising to a 5 million demand hit in Q4, and then we get back perhaps to where we were late last year by the middle of next year. So that's kind of, I think, is the optimistic. And it is a very deliberately optimistic view. It certainly could be much slower than that. It is unlikely to be faster. So if we take that sort of weak demand side, then you're still looking at having to take a lot of oil out to meet that, because the other thing we're all aware of is there is simply nowhere to store any oil. We saw that with the collapse in WTI, and it's been repeated every day on Bloomberg and CNBC and elsewhere. There is now nowhere to store oil, either on land or on sea. So you're now looking at what will happen to US supply, how compliant Russia and OPEC will be with their promises. What I believe is that OPEC plus members do not really believe that the deal that's in place will support the oil price much above the mid-20s. I'm talking about Brent now, because WTI is a fairly artificial Wall Street instrument. It is a Las Vegas chip, whereas Brent, I think, is more reflective of real world, real oil. So if we assume, therefore, that oil price around 25 average for kind of the next several weeks, then the assumption is that that price will hit the US suppliers hardest, because as we know, in the last 5 years, a lot of extra US oil has been brought on the assumption that oil will be $40 to $50. So if you keep it in the mid-20s or even lower in WTI, you could expect the hit to US shale will be a lot bigger than has been talked about. I mean, 4 to 5 million barrels in total would not be unreasonable. And if that were to happen, then that puts OPEC Plus back in the driving seat, shall we say, at the end of May. And then they could maybe manage the situation a bit better. But I really don't expect sub 20 Brent for too long if it happens, because that will hit supply faster and therefore be self-correcting. I do expect us to be somewhere in the high 20s by the time we get to June. And that's why we assume we'll be somewhere in the mid 30s in the second half of the year. But I'm not expecting anything better than that, because I think OPEC Plus will also be careful not to do anything that drives the price too high too quickly, even if they could, which I don't think they can. But even if they could, I think they wouldn't do it, because that would just bring back US shale on quicker. So I think this is going to be a much more gradual increase in the price based on demand recovery, but with a very firm eye from the Middle East and Moscow as to what's happening in the US. So don't think we're going to get free oil or sub 20 Brent for too long, but I think more like the mid 30s is realistic in the second half. But that absolutely assumes that this massive decline in demand starts to ease, and we start to see that demand destruction easing as we go up towards the end of the year.
A very quick question. There's been, of course, a lot of discussion here in Canada and the US about, relief packages put together by the government. What about relief packages in large countries like Russia? There's these measures taken by the government to stabilize the situation, keeping people's wages paid and whatnot.
The Russian government have dealt with this crisis differently, and to some extent it's positive, and in other respects it's frustrating. The positive side is that they have come into this crisis, as I mentioned, in better shape. They have more money, less debt, and they've been kind of relatively used to dealing with, to some extent, Russia's been dealing with a difficult situation almost since 08, 09. Was kind of getting out of it when we were in it to 14, 15. So we're kind of only just getting out of that again. And it has changed the attitudes. And we see, I say, frustratingly and critically, you might say, they've been a bit too laid back. But we haven't had the need for the knee-jerk reactions, the panic reactions that we've had in previous crises. And so they're applying kind of measures in terms of containment with the virus, as well as financial measures, kind of on an as need or as visible need as arisen. So there is, so they're, every week they are applying more money in terms of financial supports. They're at a very basic level though. And I would expect to see the first big budget changes in terms of policy coming in late May, early June. And right now we understand that all government ministries and all government agencies have been instructed to have a critical look at their assumptions for the year, both on spending and on revenue. And that will all come together perhaps in late May, early June with the first budget revision. And it might very well be based on $20 oil. But there is money in the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the National Welfare Fund. For example, there was about 15 billion of unplanned one-off dividend paid by the central bank, or is about to be paid by the central bank to the budget, because they sold their equity stake in Sparebank to the National Fund fairly recently, and the money they got from that was almost all profit, and they will transfer quite a lot of that, not all of it, but quite a lot of it, into the budget. And that almost covers the extra spending of $15–16 billion, covers almost the extra spending that's been done so far. So I think in the case of Russia, it'll be a case of let's see what happens to the first budget adjustment, which will come later this quarter. And then I think it'll be very much a case of looking at what is the impact when the recovery starts. Because right now they say there's money just going to keep the lights on and keep enough money into families, particularly lower income families. And that appears to be enough for now. But as we all know, the most dangerous time in any recovery from a recession or from a crisis is the first stage of recovery. That's when you get the highest number of bankruptcies and more visible problems. And so how Russia deals with that at that point, that will be the critical issue, because, big business, okay, they're just slightly changing tack a bit. Of course, one of the criticisms about Russia and the economy is the state is too big. It has too big a footprint in the economy. About 65% of GDP is accounted for by state operations. And the SME segment is too small, maybe 20 to 25, where it should really be the other way around. Now, the sector of the economy that's taken the biggest hit and will take the biggest hit and will take the longest to recovery is the SME sector. Of course, it's the retail services like manufacturing. This is where the biggest job losses and the biggest problems will be. The good news for the economy is that it's not going to affect the headline too much, because the big companies, the big industries, the big state companies will recover faster, and therefore that will drive the headline numbers. But below that, if the SMEs, where there's a lot of employment and therefore real social issues, that's where the problem will be, and that's where the government is really going to have to be careful, both in terms of economic issues, but also social and political stability. And I think right now we know this is an issue that they're worried about, but we haven't seen the measures yet. We probably will see that in the summer, and to some extent it'll be the same with the rest of the countries as well. As the problems become visible when the recovery starts, that's when your problem will be. To some extent, it's relatively easy now just to manage the containment, because you know what you need to spend, but you've no idea what you're going to need to spend once you start seeing the recovery and what the problems or what damage is being done. So this summer will be very tough.
Okay, I have one more question here, which I'm going to read to you. Thinking of the Caucasus, what impact will the crisis fallout have on the various governments' ability or willingness to meet its obligations and power purchase agreements in renewable energy projects, solar and wind? Very specific question.
Yeah, good question. And I suppose to some extent you have to kind of put that into a broader context. There is no doubt that there was greater effort at renewables and more money going into renewables when the cost of hydrocarbons was high. The cost of hydrocarbons is now a lot less and is readily available. So the bigger question is, what does that do to the whole program towards renewable when you can get very cheap petrol and very cheap gas? Why do you really want to spend a lot of money on expensive renewables? It's a bigger question globally. It's not just for the region. But I think the bottom line is, and the pragmatic answer is, it is going to slow down investment programs in most of the countries. This is not a high priority for a lot of countries. They will be much more focused on investment programs that can create employment, that can sustain growth. So like agriculture, services like manufacturing, rebuilding tourism, health services across the whole area are going to see, of course, big and sustained budgets. These will be the priorities. Renewables, I hate to say it, but I think in a lot of countries, these are deemed to be luxuries. That was a good idea, but they're not a priority at tough times. Maybe Uzbekistan will be different because they clearly they need power, more power, and they have been investing in a heck of a lot in renewables, and they have at least a good geographic location to make that work. So perhaps selectively in Uzbekistan, the programs may not be disrupted, but I think everywhere else, they have been put back by a year or two.
Okay, thank you very much. The question, I have a double question here with respect to sanctions. There's been some talk about the need to lift sanctions with respect to Iran, for instance. Would there be, in your discussions with Europeans, this idea that maybe sanctions should be lifted, and would, for instance, a country like Canada now open up its business relationship with Russia? So what do you hear in that respect in terms of, relaxing sanctions against Russia?
Well, if we were to look at Europe on its own, or maybe Canada on its own, you might be able to give something of an optimistic answer, kind of pragmatic answer, because we do know in Europe, for example, even France has been kind of pushing the idea that if Russia does make some concessions in Ukraine, etc., that could create the opportunity for relaxing sanctions. And remember, the European sanctions are very specifically, the 2014 sanctions were very specifically linked to Ukraine. And we saw late last year, surprisingly, how quickly Russia did agree the new gas transit contract with Ukraine even before the deadline. It was expected that this would run well into January or even February, but it was done by the deadline, and then Russia cut a check for almost $3 billion to settle the various legal claims. And that led to optimism that we were going to see some progress with regard to Donbass, and it was expected that there would be a Normandy meeting this month. in April where we would see progress, and that then leading to more pressure in Europe to start relaxing sanctions. So that's kind of what we were looking at, and maybe still are. But the big problem is US Congress. There is no way that the US Congress is going to agree to any reduction of sanctions against Russia. I think I am very confident in saying that statement and making that statement. If anything, the pressure for more sanctions has not gone away. It has simply been put into the pending tray because of the more urgent issues. There is a real danger that pressure for more sanctions against Russia will return before the election. I certainly think that's still a high risk. Therefore, it means that so long as the US Congress is not willing to ease sanctions against Russia, then that keeps pressure on Canada, on European Union and others to maintain their sanctions as well. And frankly, there is no point anyway or no impact on reducing sanctions by Canada or Europe, because of course, after the CATSA legislation, the one that was signed in August 2017, which brought the power over sanctions into Congress, but also introduced secondary sanctions threats. So no European company or no Canadian company or any other company in the world can take advantage of continuing US sanctions to do a deal in Russia because they risk being hit with secondary sanctions from the US. So long as US sanctions remain, everybody is covered by sanctions. And as I say, I really don't see any possibility of those sanctions being eased. If anything, there is still a lingering risk of more sanctions. In terms of when we might get to the end of sanctions, frankly, I think that President Putin is now so linked with everything that Congress sees as wrong with Russia, he will have to be completely gone before Congress will consider lifting Russia's sanctions. And very likely, well, that's a long time down the road. As we say. So no, I think, it's not a cynical answer, but I think it's a practical answer. We'll be living against this backdrop of sanctions, I think, for a very, very long time. The question is, how do you work around it? I'm sorry, I don't mean that in terms of, evasion, but just
live with them, so to speak.
Yeah. Living, yes, exactly. Thank you. That's the right word. Living with them and adapting.
Quick question with respect to real estate, housing, construction in Russia in the course of the next year. What do you expect in that respect? Lowering prices?
I think this is a priority for the government. Affordable housing was something that really was a big issue for the government. And remember, I really do, my base position is that Putin does want to address kind of real people's social issues. He understands, I think, the need to kind of bring people back inside. And what we hear in our discussions with people in administration in Moscow is that they do get that link between, lifestyles and satisfying people's economic and well-being expectations with social and political stability. So whatever, President Putin might want to do in 2024, he really needs to have kind of, perhaps not an opposition, but he wants people to be on side and supporting it, or at least not objecting to it. And that's really is linked to basic economics. And so that's why coming into this crisis, we saw a great deal of emphasis on the need to rebuild real incomes to address social concerns. And housing was one of those. So I don't see any risk of that program being scaled back in terms of national projects or government priorities. I think there is still will remain very focused on trying to provide affordable housing, first-time housing, and affordable mortgage rates for people to do it. So I think housing, like healthcare and kind of job security, I think those three will remain as high priority government areas, whereas other areas might get de-emphasized or extended. I really don't see these areas being de-emphasized. They are important, not just for economic growth, but they're also important for social and political stability, and that's important for the administration. And they can afford it.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm almost running out of questions right now, but I'll have another question. You mentioned Belarus being at a crossroads. There have been reports also about Ukraine being at a crossroads and almost flirting with default. I mean, you mentioned the difficult situation in Ukraine. What about that in the sense that it seems, how to say this, that the reporting about COVID in Ukraine is a bit understated, so to speak, because they're doing less testing. So what about the overall, and there will be fewer remittances as well. So what about the prospects for Ukraine in the next year? I think their prospects are not terribly good, but of course, Ukraine is a different ball game always.
Sure. Yeah, look, it's very critical that Ukraine gets the next tranche of IMF money this year. And they have said it themselves, and they have deliberately created or readjusted their budget with this huge deficit, 4 to 5% of GDP, with the very clear statements that they cannot afford this budget unless they get the IMF money. So they've kind of raised the stakes as well, essentially saying to the IMF and to the European Union and to Washington, saying, well, if you want Ukraine to be stable and to continue making democratic and reform progress, then we need this money, because without it, we're going to go back into a crisis. So yeah, I think that's been a deliberate action on the part of the government to kind of make sure the stakes are very visible to everybody. But really, as I say, everything we hear about talking to people in Washington anyway is that there is the political will to do it. They have slimmed their restrictions down as to what's required to get the money. But there is this critical factor, which is the bank reform, because the bank reform is not just about bank reform. The bank reform is also about sidelining the power of the most influential oligarchs that the US and Europe and everybody else says the influence of the oligarchs has been the biggest problem holding back Ukraine for a long time, and that power needs to change and to be kind of lessened and sidelined. And the banking bill is the measure that does it to a large extent. So that bill goes through, then oligarchs, a couple of well-known oligarchs take a hit, their power has been reduced, Kiev gets the money, we go forward. That bill does not pass, the oligarchs are running Ukraine, the money doesn't come, and we run a risk of a default, but you have a crisis going for longer. It really is that clear. So I'm very hopeful that it'll all go the right way, and that I would expect that as a company, Macro Advisory will be doing a lot more work for our clients in Ukraine in terms of development and understanding the country in the next several years. I think we're at that crossroads, and that's what I would expect. But clearly that bill and the money is critical to that. If it doesn't happen, then nothing else happens.
I will invite all the participants to send me more questions. I have one more question, which I think you have addressed, which with respect, the question would be, are we, after this crisis, going to go back to what there was before, or will governments try to do things differently? So you mentioned the fact that they would try to attract new investment and perhaps more localization, but do you sense that the governments are kind of saying, okay, we need to take a fresh start or go back to what it was, the old normal, so to speak? So that's a broader question, so to speak, in terms of dispositions.
Sure. Look, I think the honest answer is I don't know. Okay. If the crisis was to end tomorrow, I would say we will all go back to our bad old habits or whatever were fairly quickly. But it's not going to end tomorrow. It's going to be, we're still probably at the early stages. This is going to drag on for some time. The damage is going to be more extensive. The need for change is going to be clearer. So all I can say is, and I've forgotten who was the original person who made this quote, but the quote about never let a good crisis go to waste. And you certainly hope that governments won't let this crisis, and people won't let them either. I think that's the other factor, is that, if we're going to spend a lot of time locked in our houses and having to deal with this, and we will become, to some extent, the early days now over. We've all, I won't say novelty, because it's been, after people have died, and one should absolutely treat this with the seriousness with this. But there has been an element of kind of newness, as it were, and we're dealing with it. And now this kind of fatigue is beginning to set in, and people are becoming more critical about what's going on and what governments are doing, and that's only going to get even more so. So what my hope is that as we go through this and as kind of things ease or situations ease, but slowly, and the impact of this starts to become clearer in terms of jobs and incomes and how we used to live our lives before, that people will become a lot more demanding and won't allow their governments to go back to bad old habits, whatever that might be, and will be more expecting from their governments in terms of economics as well as social conditions and job security. And that the hope, therefore, is that does put pressure on governments to kind of go in the right direction and to attract more investment and to become more open. That's the optimist in me. But I think it's too early to say. You hope that that's what will happen. And you know, and internet and the way people interact and the awareness, I mean, you can see that's making a difference everywhere. People are very aware of what's happening around the world. They're very aware of what's happening in their neighboring countries, and therefore in a different position than their parents and their grandparents to assess what their government is doing for them. And that's changing the world. And maybe this crisis accelerates that. And I'm not a philosopher and I don't want to be, so I leave it at that. Essentially, I go back to what I said first. I don't know.
Quick question. There was a question that was put to you, that would be put to you about the approach of the Canadian government. But I guess, you know, we Canadians are better at answering that question than you know. I think the Canadian government was also trying to change its approach or moderate its approach. In prior to the crisis, there was the idea would be that the government was going to be more practical with respect to trade with Russia.
Sure.
I don't see any change right now. The question that also has been put to us is, with respect to this, would Ukraine, if the situation improves, let's say, if the relationship, prisoner exchanges, discussions in the Normandy format, what do you see about Ukraine perhaps turning a little bit more to Russia, so to speak, in terms of promoting trade? Is that a possibility? Because there were some arguments made in the local papers in Ukraine about, you know, we should, you know, Kolomoisky himself, I said, well, we should, sorry, no, we can't trust the European Union, we can't trust anybody else, maybe we should do more business with Ukraine. Do you see something?
With Russia, like, yeah.
With Russia, sorry.
Yeah. Well, you know, I would have given you probably a more optimistic answer a couple of days ago before we saw the appointment of Mr. Saakashvili to a government position, and he kind of left scratching one's head as to what does that actually mean, and given his position on Russia, how that might change things. But I do agree with you. There was certainly a move towards more pragmatism and recognizing, you know, the situation that Russia is in geographically as much as anything else. And after the fallout, of course, I suppose what you refer to as Ukraine Gate in Washington, yes, late last year. Yeah, there's a sense that, you know what, countries need to deal with their environments. In other words, who is around them. And I certainly do see the influence of President Macron and maybe of other European countries having increased, particularly President Macron, I think having looked to increase his engagement with President Zelensky and to increase, therefore, the influence perhaps of the European Union. And we could see that anyway after the election. President Poroshenko was very reliant on Washington and very focused on Washington to help him and to sustain his position. And President Zelensky is not in that position, and certainly Ukraine made that very clear very early on. So I think Ukraine is most certainly looking more at Europe for its future direction in terms of investment and trade and perhaps political engagement. And it cannot ignore the fact that there's a big trading partner next door to the east in Russia. And just come back to what you're saying about the Canadian government, one thing I could say is that what we have seen over the last year and a half is greater effort on the part of Moscow not to get involved in any fresh controversies. Generally, its position in the Middle East has been a lot calmer than it was previously. You know, it is engaged in Libya, but at a very low level. It pulled right away from Venezuela as soon as the US threatened sanctions. You know, so there's a real effort on the part of Moscow also not to get involved in more disputes or to escalate disputes, but to perhaps be a little bit more pragmatic in its relations with certainly with Europe, but with other countries as well. So yes, I do think that as we go forward, that we will see kind of a resumption of more trade between Ukraine and Russia, but on a slow level. And I think the influence of the European Union will be greater now, whereas previously it was the Washington influence that was the greatest, but I think that's already been replaced and is in the process of being replaced by greater influence from Europe for purely practical reasons. And that generally would suggest that we will see more trade opening with Russia. I don't see why not, because I do believe Moscow has already signaled its intention to be more pragmatic with Ukraine, as I say, with the contract renewal at the end of December and writing the check to settle all the outstanding legal claims. I know a few lawyers are still in tears at that, but they, it was done surprisingly quickly, and it does kind of reflect that perhaps Moscow is now looking for this not to be an obstacle to rebuilding relations with Europe in particular, as it has been, but make some compromises that might then have some dividends in terms of investment and trade with the bigger partner, which is Europe. And I get that was the sense I had from Russia before this crisis, and I don't see it's going to change anything other than maybe even a little bit more positively afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. I have two more questions. They have to do, both of them, with Eurasian Economic Union. Has it been used to address the economic downturn, and has there been any policy coordination? Will there be more pressure for integration? So it's actually three questions. Has it been used? Has there been policy coordination? And will there be pressure for more integration?
No, no, and no, I think is the three step. No, I don't see anything in terms of using it to coordinate. In fact, the Armenians have been extremely critical of the fact that the Eurasian Union has not kind of helped members. In other words, they've been very critical that they're not getting a lot of support from the wealthier members, i.e. Russia, I suppose, in particular, that, Prime Minister has been very clear in his criticism that, they thought that this club or this group would be more beneficial at times of crisis, and it hasn't been the case. And he's really called into question, what's the point in being in it? So that's what we've had rather than anything else. Mind you, we're seeing the same thing in the European Union. A lot of countries have been very critical about Germany and the kind of other bigger states not doing enough to help the countries in more crisis. So it's not unique to the Eurasian Union, but it certainly has been an issue. It's kind of been more negative than positive. And I suspect that we will get more trade deals done, but in terms of the political integration, no, I think that's probably was never going to happen anyway, but this has not helped at all. So yeah, maybe more trade deals because that's good for business, but I think that's it. It would be confined to a trade relationship, a free trade zone, as it were, or an easier trade zone. I don't see anything else, and any prospect for anything else has certainly been set back because of the way that it has not worked in this crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. Running out of questions, so maybe at this point in time, I should, as they used to say in French, we'll leave you with the mot de la fin, the last word from you, and have to wrap it up, so to speak, in terms of what your final message would be.
Well, first of all, I'd like to remind you that the presentation is a more comprehensive document and has got more information on all of the countries, so please do get that afterwards. My message now is that I suppose I'm always hopeful that crises provoke change. And we actually have seen that in the region over the last 20 odd years, that from every crisis, there has been kind of a movement forward, a faster movement. And what really makes me more hopeful about the whole region and about the direction in which the region is going is that people are changing. And I really do emphasize that so much, is that people are changing, their expectations are changing, the demographics are changing in the sense that there are more younger people coming in, they're having families, they're becoming middle class, or they want housing, they want better healthcare, they want education, and they're aware of the rest of the world. They one of the highest percentage usage of internet in the world is in the Eurasia region, so people are very well aware, and they're becoming more demanding. And I really am hopeful that that pressure is building upwards on governments and is a very positive pressure for change that we will see. And I think governments ignore it at their peril. And I do think that's a message that most governments understand, with some exceptions, of course, as we could highlight. But in general, I do think that people pressure, people's expectations, and their demands for governments to deliver on their expectations, that's a very positive change, a very positive driver.
Sorry, a new question has appeared with respect to Belt and Road Initiative, last minute. We mentioned it briefly. Will the attitude change to it? What about it in the next few years, the Belt and Road Initiative driven by China? And that will be the last question.
Sure. No, I don't see it. I mean, it's obviously it's a major infrastructure project across the region. I don't see it slowing necessarily. You know, it's something that you know, that China has invested a lot in. It's part of its long-term development strategy. I suppose, look, one area that's outside my area of competence is what might happen in terms of, you know, US-China relations, political relations. You know, will this kind of threat to blame China for this pandemic, you know, escalate, and will that isolate China? If in that case, then yes, you could certainly see a slowdown on Belt and Road and a reluctance to trade with China that could change the global dynamic in a major way. I simply don't know the answer to that. I suspect nobody does as yet. But unless that happens, if we do kind of see kind of a resumption of global trade rebuilding, then Belt and Road will remain a big part of that. And we will see, if anything, an acceleration as countries try to embrace that more as a means for them to trade, not just with China, but also, of course, more in the region, in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. So unless you get a big political fallout that isolates China, I would think Belt and Road is still going to be a huge factor and a big part of the development of the Eurasian economy and Eurasian integration with Europe, the Middle East and Asia, as we were hoping it would be. But a lot depends on the politics.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I have a mandatory point to make here, which I must not forget. Of course, your company would be happy to schedule one-on-one online sessions with company representatives if they would like to discuss further any business issues and partner with Micro Advisory. So, you know, participants can be in touch with JP Natkin, who's on this the attendee list, or Alex Grishin of CERBA in Moscow, and we will sort of share the information broadly. I think that's the point that, you know, if anybody wants to follow up on this conversation with you directly, that is possible. So you have here on the slide that is appearing the address of JP Natkin and that of Alex Grishin, and even so basically, if anyone wants to follow up with you, that is possible. Now, at this point, I would like to, on behalf of CERBA and all the participants, thank you very much for this. It was enlightening and very sort of informative, and look forward to meeting you in person finally at some point.
I hope so.
Yes,
I hope so.
Maybe in Moscow, they say, not next year in Jerusalem, but next year in Moscow, something like that.
Sure.
We'll see. Okay, thank you very much, and all the best to you.
Thank you very much, Gilda, and thank you for everybody for attending.
Okay, thank you very much.